Hey everyone, we know that a lot of you might be interested in building or buying a tiny house one day. So in this video, we want to give you more than just a tour or a profile of someone living in their tiny house. We're diving a little deeper and we're going to give you 5 really important things to consider before you build or buy a tiny house.
These are not meant to encourage or discourage you from building a tiny house, but they are problems or barriers or issues that we've seen other tiny house builders and dwellers deal with. So we want to put them on your radar so you have the chance to figure them out in advance before you decide to start a tiny house project. In terms of finances, tiny houses can be a more affordable option than a full-sized house, but there's a lot more to think about than just the price tag of the actual house. So some questions you might want to ask yourself will be, are you going to build your tiny house yourself, or are you going to have a builder do it? And look at the prices of both options. Are you going to have to buy a piece of land to park your tiny house, or will you be renting a space? Another thing that we've noticed is that a lot of people who live in tiny houses have had to find a space outside of a city center or a town center, which means they either need a car or some alternative form of transportation to get to work and just to get around, and that can add up to be a pretty big expense. Another thing to think about is that tiny houses tend to lose value or maintain their value over time rather than going up like a typical house would. A couple of reasons for that might be that people who are interested in tiny houses right now seem to want to build a custom house, so they're maybe less likely to buy someone else's home. And another thing is that tiny houses are not necessarily attached to a piece of land, and often housing prices go up based on the location of where the house is. So there's a lot of things to think about, a lot of research to do in terms of the finances associated with a tiny house project. If you're looking to try and save money, you might want to create a budget and look at, let's say, a 5-year plan. How much is your tiny house going to cost you to build and live in for 5 years? And compare that to what it would cost in your current living situation and just see which one is actually less expensive.
When it comes to location, we would definitely suggest researching and securing a place to put your tiny house before you start building or before buying. If tiny houses happen to be legal where you live or where you're thinking of moving to, you'll definitely have a much easier time finding a place for it. But in places where the rules are less clear, you should probably plan to have multiple location options just in case one of them doesn't work out. When you're looking for a location, you'll want to think about the cost. Often if people don't own the land, they'll be renting. But we've also seen some people living in tiny houses on other people's land, and instead of paying rent, they have some kind of work exchange where they maintain and work on the property, for example. So that could be something to think about. You'll also want to know if the potential location has electricity, water, and sewage hookups available. And knowing these things in advance might help you decide how to design the systems of your tiny house. On a side note, it's also really important to try and be realistic about your needs, your living situation, how many people and or pets are going to be living in the same house, and how much space you're going to need to store your stuff. These are all important things to consider ahead of time.
For insurance, you'll want to find out if you can get house insurance before you actually start your tiny house build, in case there are any requirements that the insurance company has before being willing to insure your tiny house. So for example, they may only insure a house that's been built by a professional or that has some kind of RV certification. So it makes sense to call the insurance companies in advance and find out if they're willing to insure tiny houses and what their criteria is before issuing you a policy. Because you don't want to end up with a tiny house that's all built and you've invested a lot of money in it and then no one will actually insure the value of it. Another form of insurance that you might want to consider is transportation insurance. And so when your tiny house is being moved from one location to another, it may not be insured if you're towing it yourself. One thing tiny house owners have told us is that if you hire a professional transportation service to tow your home from one place to the other, whatever they're towing is actually covered under their insurance policy. So that's one trick that some people have found to be able to have their tiny house insured while it's on the road in case something happens. But definitely do your research because that might not be the case with every company.
Climate can definitely have a huge impact on how you build a tiny house and how enjoyable it is to live in one. In warmer climates, tiny houses can overheat pretty easily, so you're going to want to think about how you're going to keep it cool. You might need an air conditioner, good insulation, strategically placed windows, and if you're going to be sleeping up in a loft, they do tend to get really hot in the summer since hot air rises. So you're going to want to plan for that. If you don't have air conditioning, you'll want to have at least 2 windows up in the loft for cross ventilation and also a good fan to keep some air flowing. In a colder climate, you might be spending a lot more time indoors, so you'll really want to think, are you the type of person who can be comfortable spending a lot of time indoors in a small space? In the winter, there are other things to think about, like how you're going to keep the house warm even when you're away. For example, if your only heat source is a fireplace, when you're not there, the house is not getting heated, and that might be something that you want to avoid. So you might want to look into another heat source or a secondary heat source that's controlled by a thermostat. You'll also want to think about how you're going to get fresh water into the tiny house and gray water out of the tiny house without your pipes freezing. You may also need to think about how to avoid condensation and humidity buildup that could lead to mold issues, and how you could skirt your tiny house to reduce cold air circulating under the house. So again, considering the climate might really affect how your house is built and designed.
When you live in an apartment or a house, you don't often think about where things like water and power come from, or where your waste goes after you flush it down the toilet or down the drain. But with a tiny house, these inputs and outputs are things you're going to have to design and plan for and manage yourself when you're living in it. If you're going to park your tiny house in the country on a big piece of land, you might be able to get away with composting your waste out there. But in a town or a city, you might not be able to do that, and so you might need to have a hookup so that you can connect to a septic tank or a sewer system. And the same goes with water. If your tiny house is parked in a remote piece of land, you might not have access to a well or to a municipal water source. So you might have to collect rainwater, or you might have to find some way of bringing water to your property and storing it for use in your tiny house. For power, depending on where you are, you might be able to just plug in, or you may need solar power or a generator, for example. So thinking about the inputs and outputs that you need to plan for in your tiny house is really important, because that will determine the types of systems you install in your tiny house.
So hopefully you found this video helpful. We thought it was really important to talk about all these issues for anyone who's in the planning process.
If you want to see tiny house tours or profiles of people living in their tiny houses, we've got a couple of great playlists for you to check out, and we'll link to those in the description below. Please subscribe if you want to see more alternative living videos. We post a new one every single week.